So today I want to talk about the physical manifestation of the Reformation. Now, in a way, what does a Reformation look like? And I suppose in many ways, the Reformation was interested in reforming many things. It reformed your theology, so the ideas about God and what God did with you and what you did with God. But also, and this is kind of important too, is that the reformers thought that this should have a consequence on the way that you lived. And they made many attempts at sort of telling people how they should live their lives, rightly or wrongly. But how you lived needed to change, and how you worshipped had to change as well. Because if you change your ideas about who God is and what he requires of you, then there's going to be some consequence in the way that you worshipped. Now, pre-Reformation, there is a lot of church building and church additions being added to churches. There's an increase. In fact, probably about in the 150 years before 1530, so this is just before sort of Henry VIII starts fiddling around with Anne Boleyn. A historian called J.J. Scarisbrick has kind of suggested, or at least he said, that at least 60% of England's churches were at that point being modified in some way with major additions and rebuildings. And the question is, what's being built? Well, there are a couple of things. So some changes are being made because of liturgical changes. So in other words, if you have an anniversary or a birth or a funeral, you want to announce it, you need a bell tower to do it. So, for example, belfries were being built. Sometimes aisles were being added to churches. Some of the older churches would just have a straight, what's called a nave, and then a chancel, and that's pretty much it. But as time went by, aisles were added on either side for chantry uses. But these have consequences. So if you add extra things, if you make a building bigger, the inside of the building becomes darker, simply because the light has further to go, and there's more things in the way. So you might have pillars or all sorts of stuff. So people begin to modify churches to add more light. So you get clerestories or naves. And if any of these are a bit complicated and you don't understand them, just look up a good book on architecture, and they'll show you some, or Google it really, and you'll find all sorts of pictures. Now, the question is, how's all this being funded? Well, absolutely, the clergy would have done some of this, or would have pushed for some of it, but a good portion of it's being funded by lay parishioners. These are guilds and fraternities, for example, who are responsible for chancels and things like this. They would engage in fundraising activities, trying to, well, it was seen as your good duty to add things and to contribute towards the church. So this is pre-Reformation. Everybody's really involved in church life because it's a major part of your day-to-day life. It's, we sort of go to church once a week, and maybe if you are very holy, you might go, to a prayer meeting. But that's only twice a week. People will go to church every day sometimes. And it's the local social, it's the local nucleus for social activities. And there are other things too, but the church is one of the main ones, more so in the medieval period, maybe than later. Post-Reformation, things slow down. Henry only had one church built during his time. Elizabeth only had 19. The Stuarts, who came after her, only had a handful of churches. And well, so that sort of begs the question as to why. Well, as you heard just from the list of people who became king and queen, you've got Henry first, Henry VIII first, then you have Edward, then you have Mary, and then you have Elizabeth, and then you have James, and then you have Charles. And so there's a whole list of people. And some of those, it's true that most of the upheaval dies down by about the time of Elizabeth, but simply between Henry and Edward and Mary and Elizabeth, there's been a lot of changes, and those changes have done a lot of damage to churches. So the question is, why would you put money into something that might get damaged next time, a new king or queen comes in and they change everything? So people are probably getting a bit weary and leery of adding too much to a church that may just get destroyed or stolen, if it's expensive, because people did put a lot of expensive things inside churches. Now, I think possibly as time goes by, moving into Elizabeth's reign and beyond, part of this is also down to the Protestant rejection of good works for salvation. Now, I don't particularly want to get into a theological argument about whether Catholics really do believe that they are saved by good works. That was certainly the Protestant understanding of Catholicism at the time. And I'm sure there's probably a good case to be made for it too, although Catholics wouldn't necessarily say that now, or at least not all of them would. But at least back then, for Protestants, you didn't get to heaven because you did good works, whereas for Catholics, you did. And so doing good works for the community and in the church are all part of this. So I think very strongly, Protestantism and its simplicity begins to change some of the ways in which churches are being decorated or not decorated, as the case may be. And we'll look at those in a minute. So the question is first, what does the inside of a church look like? So I'm going to share a screen here, and let's see if I can get this one right this time, because last time I didn't share anything. There we go, brilliant. So churches are laid out east to west. And I'm going to see if I can get my an annotation pen. I've got a spotlight, brilliant, here we go. Over here, okay, so this is the church. So you come in, the church is laid east to west, and that has been ever since the Roman period. I think there's some original theological reason as to why. I can't actually remember why. It's probably got to do with something with the rising sun, and probably a pun on that. I don't know. Anyway, it's east to west, and so when you would come in, and outside of the west door here, there is a porch, and the porch is a very important place because this is where, first things, you would encounter the stoop, and the stoop is a receptacle where you would have holy water, and you would stop in and you'd stick your fingers inside and make the sign of the cross on you, and in you go. But it's also the place where all the ceremonies begin. And remember that while there are church things, there are also social things taking place in a church. The church is the social linchpin of many events, and that includes things like marriages. And so this is where you would exchange your vows, for example. The churching of women after you've given birth, there's a sort of a ceremony to get you back into church again because you're considered unclean, and that's something that I think goes back. Now I'm going to say it's Deuteronomy, but it actually might not be. It might be Leviticus. It goes back a long way there. The churching of women, or baptism, or funerals. I mean, all sorts of events. They all begin in the porch. So this is kind of the first thing that you would encounter coming in. And when you get inside, what you'd have is a font over here, and you can sort of see this is probably where baptisms of babies would have taken place. And of course, all babies are baptized. They are very often baptized. We don't believe in, as Adventists, we don't believe in infant baptism, but back then you are baptizing the child on behalf of the church, so to speak. So the church is basically saying, we're baptizing you, but we're taking responsibility for you until you can grow up and make the correct choice yourself. Anyway, so you'd come in, and then this is the nave. Now, this is the nave where everybody was. Now, there are no pews in the nave until maybe much later on, actually. Naves are the place for the laity. And you stood up. Sometimes later on, they were fold-down seats, I think. But it's all standing room. And all around you, on either side of you, would be decorations and murals and pictures of various things. Pictures from the Bible, stories from the Bible, allegories, to help you as a person understand what it is, what is your responsibility on earth, and what is it that you should know. And sometimes there'd be a pulpit and a lectern up here, if there was any talking going on. But at least in the Catholic Church, what you've got, the most important part is this stuff at the end, at the east end of the church, which is called the chancel. Now, there's a rood screen in the middle that separates you from the rest of the laity. As a priest, you are separated. Now, actually, I can't remember. I don't know the theological reason why, and I should probably look it up. But this is to separate you from what is going on. And it was considered, a theological point. The priesthood is separated from the laity. And we know this because later on it would get removed. So we've got the chancel, and the chancel would have a picture of Christ on the cross there, or a ornamentation, maybe a wood carving of Christ on the cross. And on the north side, so west, I think this is the north side here, if I've got my cardinal points correct. You would have maybe the Virgin Mary and various female saints, generally virgins and martyrs, on this side. There's a place where you could go and worship and pay your respects. And on the other side, in the transept, you'd have maybe Saint John on the other side, the most beloved disciple of Jesus. You might have an assortment of other male saints and maybe local saints, although we lost a lot of local saints once the French invaded in 1066, but there's still some, although there might have been more more recent saints. But really, the main point is this little square rectangle up here, which is this is the altar, because this whole thing here is to do with the Mass. The whole point of this is the Mass. And you'd have an altar that's symbolizing Christ's sacrifice. You sacrifice things, you sacrifice a lamb on an altar. And there would be 5 crosses cut into it sometimes, symbolizing the wounds of Christ. There are 5 stigmata, and I can't remember them all off the top of my head. It's going to be the wounds in your feet, the wounds in your hands, the spear in your side, the crown of thorns on your head, and one more, which I can't remember. Sometimes in this section, you'd have a sepulchre, a tomb, maybe on Good Friday, which, is a symbol of Jesus coming out of the tomb. And this is the domain of the priest only. So only the priest goes in here, and maybe some altar boys. And it would have everything that you would need to carry out the service. You'd have the censer to swing the incense around, to, sweet-smelling smoke. You'd have the pyx. The pyx is a box. It's about this big, and about this big. Should make sure I'm looking at the camera. And it would hold all the communion wafers in it, which at various points would only be for the priests, and maybe at some points would be for the laity. It depends where we are. There'd be a piscina, maybe, which is sort of a receptacle for getting rid of all the liquids. Of course, when you take the blood of Christ, you've got bits left over in the cup. What do you do with it? Sometimes it's drained out, but very often it's drunk. At least it more later on, it was generally drunk. And woe betide you if you go to a proper alcohol drinking church, as the stuff that they use there is fortified wine or fortified port. It's about 40% proof. So if you have it nowadays, it's pretty potent. Back then, it probably wasn't that potent. We're probably looking at probably around 12%, I think, alcohol content, or maybe less. But nonetheless, there are plenty of examples of priests getting drunk on this kind of stuff. So, it happened. Anyway, so the priest goes there and he does his bits and pieces, and the whole thing is a feast for the senses. It's full of stained glass windows, which those guilds and fraternities would have contributed towards. It will have wall paintings telling you the stories. It would have carvings and sculptures. The ceiling would have been painted with the glories of heaven and angels. There would be candles and incense, and it's all very exciting. And that's it. But by the time we get to the Protestants, then things begin to change a little bit. Now, here are some contemporary woodcuts of what Protestantism was interested in. And as you can see, it's a very different kind of situation. Most of the problems that the Protestants had with the whole situation were theological problems with virtually, well, pretty much everything that was going on in a Catholic church. So if you remember, the rood screen separates the laity, which are all down here, from the priesthood. But in Protestantism, we have the priesthood of all believers. And so that means the rood screen gets taken down. Now, the communion, we have a commemoration of the Last Supper. Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me." It is not a reenactment of a killing, which is essentially what a mass is. The mass is a reenactment of Calvary. And because you're not performing a sacrifice, you don't need an altar. So it's replaced, as this little picture here shows you here, with a communion table. And this is especially true for the Zwinglians and the Calvinists. For those of you who are Adventists, we are Zwinglians. We do communion in remembrance of it. Lutherans kind of have something called consubstantiation, and so the whole thing is slightly different. It's kind of like a halfway between commemoration and the real presence of Jesus in the elements, in the bread and wine. So because you don't have these things, for example, you don't need a pyx anymore. You don't need the box to hold the communion wafers because you're just eating bread. Lights and images were problems for Protestants and also the Catholic reformers, it has to be noted. And so many of them were a little bit nervous about so many things around them distracting them. And what they are most interested in is the concentration on the word. Now, as I said, the Protestant understanding of Catholic theology was that when you do certain things to gain your salvation. But as a Protestant, your salvation is based on hearing the word of God, as in you don't do certain things to gain merit in God's eyes. So you don't baptism, taking the Mass, the last rites, all the sacraments that give you almost physically bits of grace. None of this exists in Protestantism. You get this from hearing and listening and doing the word, which then means that has to be communicated to you in some way. So churches need to be designed so you can hear what is being said. That is the most important thing. And so churches then begin to require pulpits. Archbishop Bancroft in 1604 required all churches to have pulpits, and some of them were quite tall. And so this is, you can see the preacher from all the way in the back of the church. And if you go to some English churches, which we hopefully might do, or you should do at least if you're here, you will see that some of these, you have to climb a set of steps to get to the pulpit. This is explicitly so you can see the preacher all the way from the back of the place. And also, we talked about the nave being standing room only with only a few pews. Now there are pews. Some of them even are quite comfortable. And again, if you go to some of the higher and what we might call high churches, they will have very comfortable pews with little boxes for various families, which families would donate, and they would sort of get to sit in them. They might have curtains in them. There's all sorts of things going on. Now, so this is what a Protestant church sort of roughly would look like. Here's another picture here. Again, you don't need very much. There's a table, there's the bread and the wine, and everybody is clustered around it. It looks sort of vaguely Jacobean. I think this is a Jacobean period one. You don't need a very fancy place to do this in. Now, that's not to say that there aren't any sort of nice. Sorry, here's a picture of a rood screen. Here you go. Here's a picture of Christ on the cross, and this is blocking you from the rest of everything there. That's blocking your view into. You're looking now into the chancel here. Just make sure. Nope, that's the end of my pictures. So there are internal decorations in Protestant churches, but they tend to be painted boards of biblical texts, or possibly the royal coat of arms. Elizabeth I, sorry, yes, we have to say that now because we've had two, said that the 10 Commandments should be placed in the east end of the church. So we've got the 10 Commandments possibly down here somewhere. Some of them are filled up with family memorials, large and ornate tombs, which are often very expensive. in place. Now, so there are some Protestant changes. Now, the question is, when did these take place? Henry wasn't very interested in any of this. It mostly takes place in Edward the Sixth's reign and also Elizabeth I's reign. And there are some later changes during Charles I, but that's pretty much the end of it. Now, as I said, the Protestants had a lot of trouble with, or theological trouble with, some of this. And this results in something called iconoclasm, which is a lovely, fantastic subject that we won't really spend a lot of time on, but you should at least be passingly aware. Iconoclasm is literally the destruction of icons or pictures, and it has a very long and illustrious history going back into the Orthodox Church. I'm going to say around the somewhere between the 600s and 800s. That's when we have the first rounds of iconoclasm. Essentially, some people say, some of the great theological people of the church said we shouldn't be having pictures and things in church. And the then Orthodox and Catholic churches hummed and hawed and had lots of arguments over this. And eventually they came round to it at the Second Council of Nicaea, I think it was, in 800 and something. They decided that, actually it was okay to have icons and things in church. And that's why if you go to a Catholic church, and if you go to an Orthodox church, a Greek Orthodox church, or a Syrian, any of the very old churches, they are full of pictures, and that's because they basically changed their minds that it actually was okay to have images in church, which I think is a theological setback. But iconoclasm is the breaking and destruction of images, and this is mostly officiated by the government and then enthusiastically taken over by, I suppose you might call them the hotter sort of Protestants. It really begins with Thomas Cromwell's injunction of 1536 and 1538, which forbids lighting candles, offering money, and praying to images. I'm going to stop sharing here. Sorry, just because this is, I don't think it's quite, let me see if I can. We'll stop that share then. So Thomas puts these injunctions in, and in the process is actually some of the images are burned in front of crowds to show that these things are useless. So the Protestant understanding was that Catholics were praying to specific images. And that's probably true in a lot of cases. Now, maybe the more sophisticated Catholics would say, no, we're only praying to the concept behind the image. The image is there to sort of help you. But when it comes down to sort of folk religion, I suppose, or folk piety, most people can't or don't differentiate between that. My brother used to work in Ireland and said, the religion over there was very, very superstitious in the same way. So Thomas Cromwell gets rid of many images. He doesn't get rid of all of them. Not every image is destroyed, only those that are not useful. And Thomas Cromwell eventually falls, and Henry is not particularly enthusiastic about this whole business of destruction, so it sort of dies down a bit until Edward VI comes along. Now, the protector of Edward VI, Somerset, the Duke of Somerset, is very enthusiastic about destroying the Catholic elements in churches. And I suppose from one perspective, this is a terrible tragedy, but he destroys many of the stained glass windows. In fact, this is an action that's carried out by a series of Protestant reformers, and I think there's hardly any churches with the original stained glass windows in them. I think they're all much, much later, 17th, 18th, or 19th century. There's very, very, very few from this time period or before. So during Edward's reign, stained glass windows go, the sepulchres go. There's an injunction in 1547 against images and rood screens. So all the pictures that are in churches or painted on the walls are whitewashed. Stained glasses are removed, images are removed, and teams will go up and down the country making sure this had actually taken place. Now, eventually, some of this is done for profit. If you imagine that churches are full of very expensive things, gold and silver items, the crown was in debt and the churches were full of money. So in a way, this is a good way of retrieving or gaining money for the crown under the guise of Reformation. those things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. You can reform, but it also happens to help the church at the same time. But this is not incredibly popular. If you can imagine somebody comes in and suddenly decides that your church needs to be completely redone, and you've spent the last 10 years raising money to decorate part of it, and your grandparents donated a wing of the church. And you can imagine all the things that medieval people had contributed to the church, and then all of a sudden they're getting rid of everything. So people very often would hide things. If they knew these teams were coming along, they would take the things out of the church and hide them, bury them. Because when Mary comes onto the throne after Edward, everything gets restored. Many of the things are hidden away and then brought back and put into place. And the whole system begins to start up again. So altars and vestments, books, the sepulchres and crosses are replaced. Then the rood screens come back and images are there. And communities begin to support with donations again, or with bequeathments upon somebody's death, to rebuild and to prettify the churches. And then by the time we get to Elizabeth, which is the final phase, there's some sort of reversal. It's not as full as Edward's, which of course to some reformers was a sign of the lukewarm nature of it. But there is an injunction against images that, quote, feigned miracles, pilgrimages, idolatry, and superstition. So there is still a very strong reforming element, whether you are a Protestant or a Catholic. In fact, many of these things should have been reformed. But these are also injunctions against all of this stuff, not only in churches, but also in houses. And this sort of goes on until about 1561. Elizabeth then thought, well, things have gone on too far, or perhaps this has gone on too far. Many of the bishops came back after the Marian exile, and they were full of enthusiasm. And the bishops were sort of gung-ho about doing this. But Elizabeth is okay with this to a certain point, but didn't love it. Wasn't very sort of excited about seeing all of this. So that's kind of like a very short sort of look at the Reformation. For those of you who may be coming, not this year, but next year, we quite possibly will go and see a church where the church gets reformed, but only halfway through. If you imagine a church that starts out being Catholic at one end and then moves towards the other end and turns into a Protestant church, it's the Fitzwilliam Chapel. It's kind of an interesting sign, because it's an interesting thing because you can see how far the Reformation got and what it did to the church, and then it didn't go any further. And it's just kind of an interesting sort of example of what happens. But otherwise, pretty much most Anglican churches and chapels are all altered irrevocably. Every now and then, somebody digs something up and finds something behind a whitewashed wall. I think there was a man this week up in York who had actually been doing something to his kitchen and found a whole series of things hidden behind his kitchen wall, I think, that were religious in nature. And it goes back to the 1500s or before. But yes, a lot of this has disappeared. Now, whether you think this is a good idea or not is whether you're an art historian or whether you're a Christian, because one of those people, or maybe a bit of both, the loss of some of this is a great cultural loss, in a way. There is a question to be said of whether everything should be preserved. Historians want everything to be preserved, but you cannot preserve everything, so some things have to go. But of course, as a reformer, as a Christian, you're meddling around with people's eternal futures. So, whether this is a good thing or not is kind of where you sit along that theological spectrum. But those are some of the changes. And hopefully, if we will try and go to Windsor at some point and see some of the church, you can see some of what's called High Church Anglicanism, which is where the church kept many of the Catholic things, or a lot of the Catholic things, but was Anglican in terms of its service, in terms of the theology was Protestantism, or Protestant, but the trappings of the church were quite Catholic in a way. That's called High Anglicanism or High Church. And then we go down to something called Broad Church or Low Church, which is more the traditional sort of, if you think of the Methodist chapels, it's sort of very simple, very whitewashed walls and a clear thing. Pretty much any Adventist church is essentially a low church or a broad church, inheritor of those things. So that will just give us a little bit of an idea of what it is. So I will see you in the next lecture, where we'll be talking about James I. We're stopping with Elizabeth now and moving into the Stuarts.